Hello and welcome. My name is Matt Bowling. I am an eCampus student in the Environmental Sciences graduate program at Oregon State University. For my final project, I looked at Bend, Oregon, Boise, Idaho, and Bozeman, Montana. These are three of the fastest growing cities in the western United States, and I wanted to understand if the growth that's occurring in these cities was resulting in any adverse environmental impacts. Typically, there's a correlation between anthropogenic activity and harmful impacts to the natural environment. To answer this question and other questions, there was a combination of quantitative and qualitative tools employed. I looked at population growth with data from the U.S. Census Bureau. I assessed riparian health using a UAV over major waterways in each metropolitan area. Using a UAV, I also looked at urban to rural interface points, along with gaining observational data from windshield and walking surveys. And I did some water quality tests on the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River. But before getting too far along, let's take a look at a map and see where Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are located. Here's a map that shows the location of Bend, Boise, and Bozeman. Starting from the left and working our way to the right, which will be from west to east, you see Bend, Oregon, which is in central Oregon. That is high desert. Boise, Idaho, which is the state capital for the state of Idaho, and then Bozeman, Montana, which is about 95 miles from Yellowstone National Park. All three of these metropolitan areas are located in river valleys. The Deschutes River flows through the city of Bend, Oregon. The Boise River flows through the city of Boise, Idaho. And the Gallatin River is located within close proximity of Bozeman, Montana. From end to end, there's about 853 kilometers separating Bend, Oregon from Bozeman, Montana. That's roughly 530 miles. Both Boise and Bozeman are on major interstate highways. Boise is on Interstate 84. Bozeman, Montana is on Interstate 90. You'll also notice that Bozeman sits at a higher latitude than either Bend or Boise, which are both in high desert climates. This bar graph shows the percent growth rate from 2010 to 2020 in Bend, Oregon, Boise, Idaho, and Bozeman, Montana, which are represented in orange. Some of the bellwethers that we can measure this growth rate by are represented in black for the national average, the state of Oregon, the state of Idaho, and the state of Montana. The national average from 2010 to 2020 for percent growth rate was 7.4%. By comparison, Bend, Oregon grew by 29.4%. Boise, Idaho grew by 26.1%, and Bozeman, Montana grew by 42.9%. These are not only exponentially growing cities, the counties they're located in are also the fastest growing counties in each of their respective states. This stands out. It's remarkable because as a whole, population in the United States is leveling. Birth rates are on the decline. Absent immigration, the country's population would be trending downwards. Since the year 2000, geographic mobility within the United States has been declining. People are moving less than they had before. Why people are moving less is complicated, but it makes what's happening in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman all the more notable and all the more interesting to kind of look at from a case study perspective. If you were to group all the reasons why people make a move, a cross-jurisdictional move, a cross-state move to a place like Bend, to a place like Boise, to a place like Bozeman, you'd be able to group those reasons into three general categories that would overarch them all. Those categories are location, housing, and jobs. One of the factors that drives people to make a move to Bend, Boise, and Bozeman is the cost of housing. And if one were to look at face value, at the sticker price of homes in these communities, they might be taken aback because you might look at it and say, well, those prices seem relatively high to me, but it's all about where the people that are making the move are coming from and what housing costs are where they're coming from. Their money goes further in these communities. It is enabling them to obtain the single-family detached home they may not be able to obtain in the community they're moving from. Between 2019 and 2020, Idaho was the fastest growing state in the country. Boise was the fastest growing city in the country. And according to the Boise Valley Economic Partnership, Californians accounted for 46% of the migration that occurred during this time. A United Van Line study found that nearly 63% of all moves in Oregon were from out of state. In Montana, a study by Montana State University Billings found that 43% of buyers that were moving to Montana were moving to be closer to family, and 36% were originally from the state of Montana. The same study noted that 75% of realtors surveyed had clients, and this includes buyers and sellers, from California. 56% had clients from Washington, and 49% had clients from Colorado. The dominant form of residential construction occurring in these communities are single-family detached homes, and that's because the majority of Americans prefer to live in single-family detached homes. This is something we'll touch on in more detail later in the presentation. Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are all major regional employment hubs. They have hospitals and schools. Major corporations are located within their municipal limits. There's abundant service sector employment. There's a synergistic effect from the construction that's occurring in these communities through the construction trades, from foundation through fit and finish. Those all require people to build these structures, to build these buildings, and those equate to jobs and tax revenue. Each of these communities are home to state universities. Oregon State University Cascades is located in Bend. Boise State University is located in Boise, and Montana State University is located in Bozeman. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic accelerated a work-from-home movement across the United States, these communities had a significant portion of their population that were working from home. In 2018, Bend Redmond led the state of Oregon in the number of employees who work from home, including a significant number who work for jobs at technology companies located in Silicon Valley, California. It should also be noted that Boise is the state capital of Idaho. There is a significant number of jobs that come from the presence of the state capital being within municipal limits. Each of these communities are set in spectacular natural settings, and having access to recreational opportunities within these natural settings may be one of the greatest draws that these communities have for attracting cross-jurisdictional migrants. A 2002 article that described migratory patterns to the New West by Hansen and team noted something called the 1 hour rule. I was really taken in by this concept of the 1 hour rule, that people were moving to the New West because they wanted to be within 1 hour of excellent outdoor recreational opportunities, things like fishing, hiking, and skiing. And I think the 1 hour rule could be applied to Bend, Boise, and Bozeman. Each of these communities are located in river valleys. Bend is in central Oregon. The Cascade Mountains are located within eyesight. Oregon's high desert surrounds the community. Boise is also in the high desert. It's situated on the Boise River. The foothills of the Rocky Mountains serve as a backdrop for the city. Bozeman is in the Rocky Mountains. It's within about 95 miles of everything Yellowstone National Park has to offer. In addition to their geographic location, each of these communities have capitalized on their excellent downtown cores to create a remarkable sense of place. And sense of place is qualitative. It's not something that can really be measured. It's something that must be experienced. You can hardly describe it, but you know it when you see it. You know it when you feel it. You know it when you experience it. There are cultural amenities, there's restaurants, there's shops. It's a pedestrian-scaled environment. There's ways to get around the city on foot. There's ways to get around the city by bike. There's trail systems that connect to larger trail systems. There's parks. There's places to view wildlife. There's murals painted on alley walkways. These cities have done an excellent job within their downtown cores of creating a sense of place. There were three primary research questions underlying this report. First, to what extent, if any, is suburban and exurban sprawl occurring in these communities? Number two, if suburban and exurban sprawl is occurring, what adverse environmental impacts are resulting from these growth patterns? And number three, what cross-jurisdictional lessons were learned that could help these communities and others grow smartly, maximizing their resiliency and their sustainability in the era of climate change? The mission matters. The motive matters. In this instance, the research hoped to inform our conversation, our collective conversation on sustainability and resiliency in the era of climate change. The construction industry, building, is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. In 2019, the International Energy Agency noted that construction and buildings accounted for 39% of energy and process-related CO2 emissions globally. Concrete production accounts for approximately 8% of CO2 emissions globally. The only resource we consume more of than concrete is water. I was taken aback by this when I read it, but I verified it. I checked in a few places just to confirm. But we use collectively as a planet a lot of concrete, and a lot of that concrete goes to urbanization as our cities are being built out. By comparison, the aviation industry, which has come under a lot of discussion and scrutiny in recent years, accounts for roughly 2.5% of global CO2 emissions on an annual basis. The T that's in the middle of your screen stands for TELOSA, and TELOSA was announced in September of 2021. It is a master planned community set on 150,000 undeveloped acres in the United States. They're looking in Appalachia, Arizona, Idaho, Nevada, Texas, and Utah for potential sites for construction. The project is being backed by Mark Lowry, the former CEO of Walmart's e-commerce platform in the United States and the founder of several electronic commerce businesses. And it's noble in concept. It's utopic in vision, but it's not the answer. We're not going to build our way out of the sustainability crisis. We're not going to address climate change by constructing cities on 150,000 undeveloped acres in the American West. It'd be much better if we could figure out how to consume less, if we could figure out how to maximize the lifespans of our existing cities. And this is not a new concept. Just recently, the Royal Academy of Engineers in the UK said as much, that we really need to be looking at adaptive reuse. We need to stop knocking down buildings. We need to figure out how to use what we have to the maximum extent practicable, because what we have embodies a lot of carbon. It took a lot of carbon to construct our buildings, our roads, our infrastructure. Moreover, TELOSA is not needed. As we discussed earlier in this presentation, the population of the United States would not be growing absent immigration. Our population is currently leveling on the whole. We're not running out of places for people to live in the United States, and this extends globally as well. The United Nations notes that the world's population will peak by 2100. That is not a far distant future. That's in less than 80 years. The world's population is going to reach its maximum extent, and then it's anticipated that it will start to decline. And then the question becomes, can we reduce our consumption before reaching peak population globally? Can we figure out ways to consume less, to be more resilient, to be more sustainable in the years leading up to 2100, rather than waiting till we reach our maximum extent in terms of population, consuming more and more and more each year up into that point to address the climate change crisis confronting our planet? Data sets from the U.S. Census Bureau's Decennial Census, along with the American Community Survey, were used to analyze population growth patterns in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman. One of the important lessons to come out of the research conducted for these communities on population growth was that increased population density and suburban and exurban sprawl are not mutually exclusive. They both can occur within a community. The construction booms that are currently underway in these three communities are being fueled by the construction of single-family detached homes. Every 10 years since 1790, the United States has conducted a decennial census. It is a critical component to a functioning democracy. As populations shift or increase, representation in the U.S. House of Representatives shifts accordingly. For this scope of work, the 2020 Decennial Census was compared with the 2010 Decennial Census and the 2000 Decennial Census to establish population counts and growth rates. The data was organized by each municipality and included each respective county, with pertinent state data provided as well. Tables and figures were developed for each community, and we'll go over those now over the next few slides. For single-family detached home estimates, the U.S. Census Bureau's 2019 American Community Survey was the dataset referenced. From 2010 to 2020, Bend added 22,539 residents, bringing its total population to 99,178. This represents a 29.4% increase. It is the largest city in Deschutes County, which also increased its population from 2010 to 2020 by 25.7%. Over half of the population that was added in Deschutes County between 2010 and 2020 occurred in the city of Bend. The city of Bend's footprint changed very, very slightly from 2010 to 2020. It added 0.31 square miles during this 10-year span, less than a 1% increase in terms of geographic footprint. Deschutes County's boundaries did not change during this period of time. As such, Bend's residents per square mile went up by 600 during this 10-year span, from 2,322 residents per square mile in 2010 to 2,976 residents per square mile in 2020. An estimated 69.4% of the occupied households in Bend were single-family detached homes. This compares to 74.3% for Deschutes County and 63.6% for the state of Oregon. It is estimated that over 42% of these occupied housing units were constructed after the year 2000. The aerial photographs that are on the screen now show some of the housing that was recently constructed in the city of Bend. The photograph on the left shows the Southwest Bend neighborhood. You'll note the house that's currently under construction and the lower frame of that photograph. The photograph on the right shows the Mountain View neighborhood, which is on Bend's eastern edge. The scale and pace of development in Boise is much different than what is occurring in Bend and Bozeman. From 2010 to 2020, Boise grew from 205,671 residents to 235,684 residents. Those are residents in the city of Boise. Ada County, the county where Boise is located, grew from 392,365 residents to 494,967 residents during that same 10-year period, a 26.1% increase. This is notable. In 2010, there were more people living in the city of Boise than in Ada County. By 2020, this had changed. More people now live in Ada County than in the city of Boise. 259,283 residents in Ada County do not live in Boise's municipal limits. To the west of Boise is the city of Meridian. Meridian is the fastest growing city in the state of Idaho. From 2010 to 2020, it added 7.24 square miles to its geographic footprint, a 27% increase in terms of its municipal boundaries. To the west of Ada County is Canyon County, and Canyon County is growing rapidly as well. Canyon County grew from 188,923 residents in 2010 to 231,105 residents in 2020, a 22.3% increase. In terms of single-family detached homes, the 2019 American Community Survey data revealed that an estimated 66% of occupied housing units in Boise were single-family detached. This compares with 84.1% in Meridian and 75.3% in Napa. In Meridian, the American Community Survey estimated that 60.8% of occupied housing units were constructed after the year 2000. The images on the screen now are aerial photographs that were taken in the Boise metropolitan area in October of 2021. The background image is from Caldwell, Idaho, which is actually in Canyon County, and that is land for sale right off of Interstate 84. The aerial photograph on the left shows some of the development actually happening within municipal limits for the city of Boise. You can see the subdivision being constructed, and then the cornfield where the roads in the subdivision abruptly end. And you see a lot of this occurring in Boise. You see it happening in all three of these communities. in Bend, in Boise, and in Bozeman, but especially in Boise, where you see farmland being converted to single-family detached home subdivisions. The photograph in the upper right, the aerial, is from Meridian. That is the fastest growing city in the state of Idaho, and that is one of many subdivisions that are currently under construction, and if not under construction, recently constructed. Bozeman, Montana is the smallest of the 3 municipalities that were looked at for this report. It has a population in 2020 of 53,293, and that's a considerable growth from what the population was in 2010 when it came in at 37,280. It represents a 42.9% increase. So while it is the smallest in terms of population of the 3 municipalities, it experienced the highest growth rate from 2010 to 2020. Comparatively, Gallatin County, the county where Bozeman is located, added an additional 29,447 residents from 2010 to 2020. Near the city of Bozeman is the city of Belgrade. In 2010, the city of Belgrade's population was 7,389, and by 2020, it had grown to 10,460, an increase of 41.6%. There are a number of unincorporated census-designated places, CDPs, within proximity of Bozeman that are seeing notable population growth. One such CDP is Four Corners, which saw its population grow from 3,146 in 2010 to 5,901 in 2020. Now, the city of Bozeman did add some square miles to its geographic footprint from 2010 to 2020. It grew by 1.23 square miles during this time span, representing a 6.4% increase. And the city of Belgrade also added some land to its geographic footprint, adding a 0.74 square miles from 2010 to 2020, which represents a 22.7% increase in its geographic footprint. Like Boise, both the city of Bozeman and the city of Belgrade increased their population per square mile from 2010 to 2020. So did Gallatin County. But again, it should be noted that while they did increase their population density in these respective municipalities, they also annexed land into their municipalities to accommodate additional population growth, and much of this construction came in the form of single-family detached homes. The aerial photograph on the right side of the screen now shows a subdivision that was constructed in Four Corners, Montana. Four Corners is one of those unincorporated, census-designated places that are growing in Gallatin County. Before going ahead and diving into the riparian assessments that were completed for this report, I want to touch on single-family detached home construction and what impacts single-family detached home subdivisions potentially have on the natural environment. As we've gone over the population growth analyses that were completed for Bend, Boise, and Bozeman, I hope that it's painted a picture that accurately portrays what's happening on the ground in these communities. There is a lot of single-family detached home construction occurring in Bend, in Boise, and in Bozeman. So much so that it does raise some questions about what impact does this form of construction have on the natural environment. In many instances, the land that is being used for these subdivisions was previously in a natural state. It was woodlands, it was scrublands, it was desert, it was greenfield. It was not previously developed in any commercial or residential form. Now, it might have been agricultural, it might have been land that was used for farming or ranching, but even in those instances, they were not industrial operations. They were family-owned farms. They were family-owned ranches that were rather small in scale. From a pure building form perspective, just in terms of how a building is constructed, single-family detached homes are among the least efficient. They require more land to accommodate a fewer number of people. Not only that, they're typically built in subdivisions that are further afield. They're located in suburban and exurban areas that are disconnected from the urban core. This results in a situation where people living in these low-density single-family detached home subdivisions have to rely on their vehicles more. Brookings Institution researchers note the following, and I quote, "The low-density nature of single-family suburban development requires their residents to travel long distances, 7 miles per trip on average by car for work and leisure, such that these residents emit an estimated 12.2% more carbon dioxide per year than their urban counterparts." End quote. Now this presents a paradox because of a very simple fact. Most Americans want to live in single-family detached homes. The vast majority of Americans want to live in single-family detached homes. In 2019, Redfin surveyed millennial homebuyers, and 90% said that they would choose a single-family home over an equally priced unit in a triplex, even if the triplex had a shorter commute. Amongst all homebuyers and sellers, 85% noted that they preferred single-family detached homes over multifamily options. In 2019, the U.S. Census Bureau's American Community Survey found that 62.4% of all Americans lived in single-family detached homes. Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are each in river valleys. In Bend, the Deschutes River flows north through the city and is a tributary of the Columbia River. The Boise River flows west through the city of Boise and is a tributary of the Snake River. The Gallatin River is located outside of Bozeman's municipal limits, but its tributaries can be found throughout the city. Each of these rivers have a high degree of water quality, and each of them are integral parts of the local economy. Recreational-based tourism brings visitors to these waterways for fishing, rafting, hiking, canoeing, kayaking, and wildlife viewing. And these outdoor-based recreational opportunities are not just limited to tourists. Residents enjoy engaging in these activities as well. In addition, farming and ranching are at the foundation of each of these communities. They have been integral economic fixtures since these cities were founded, and water quality is important for a functional farm or ranch. Riparian health has never been more important, especially in urbanized areas. Areas that are developing rapidly have a tendency to have a degradation in water quality. What riparian buffers do is modulate water temperature. They absorb excessive nutrients and pollution. They provide habitat to a variety of terrestrial, amphibian, and aquatic species. Riparian areas also serve as incubation areas for species that would otherwise struggle to survive. The species that are incubated in riparian areas are often food sources for species in the water, such as trout. And all three of these rivers are world-renowned trout fisheries. A degradation in the robustness of riparian buffers could have serious consequences for the trout species that inhabit these rivers, which in turn could damage the recreational fishing tourism industry, an industry that depends on healthy trout being present. Riparian buffer assessments were conducted for the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River in October of 2021. An uncrewed aerial vehicle, a UAV, was used to measure buffer widths, assess riparian vegetation health, and examine surrounding land uses. The UAV used for these analyses was the DJI Mini SE. The DJI Mini SE weighs less than 249 grams and folds to a size of 138 millimeters by 81 millimeters. Makes for really easy transport. The flight time, which is determined by battery life, is dependent on weather conditions. Colder temperatures can adversely affect battery life, and high and gusting winds can require the motors to operate with higher revolutions per minute, which also can decrease battery life. On average, the onboard battery provided approximately 20 to 23 minutes of flight time. The operating controller connects to a smartphone, and the user operates the UAV through an application on the smartphone. The phone screen provides a live video feed and some basic flight data, for example, altitude, distance, and speed. Once the flight is complete, the video can be downloaded to your phone, and it can be edited as needed by the user. The DJI Mini SE uses a radio frequency, an RF, to connect the operating controller to the flying unit. If the RF signal is lost, the flying unit can become disconnected from the operating controller. For this reason, flights were limited to 900 to 1,000 meter reaches on the respective rivers under examination. During the analyses that were completed, it was typical for the RF signal to become weakened at between 400 and 500 meters. A weak RF signal is not good. If the controller becomes disconnected from the flying unit, you can lose operational control of the UAV. This can lead to crashes or flyaways. On more than one occasion, flights were aborted or returned to the takeoff point prior to completion due to gusting wind conditions. An example of such conditions can be seen on the screen now. You'll notice that the trees are swaying from the gusting winds. You'll notice also that the UAV is not staying over the river. Every attempt was made to fly the UAV over the center line of the river. But in this instance, the winds were blowing at such a rate, the UAV kept getting pushed off course. You'll also notice that the gusting winds caused the horizon line to be lost. The UAV is actually flying at an angle at certain points in this short clip. In this instance, the UAV was returned to the takeoff and landing point and landed. The riparian assessment was completed the next day. Over the next several slides, you'll see how the riparian assessments were completed for the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River. Reach segments measured between 900 and 1,000 meters. Takeoff points were selected by studying satellite imagery and identifying publicly accessible areas. When selecting takeoff points, airports were avoided, as were any areas with flying hazards, such as overhead power lines. During flight, the flying unit was positioned above the approximate center line of the respective river at an altitude between 110 to 120 meters. During flight, both photographs and aerial video was taken. The camera was generally positioned at approximately 90 degrees facing down for the video segments. It was adjusted accordingly for still photography. Latitude and longitude were recorded at each takeoff and landing point. Prior to takeoff or after landing, a tape measure was used to measure a known distance in a vicinity to provide a spatial reference for analyzing photographs and video during post-production. If this was not possible, imagery was reviewed with online geospatial measurement tools. During post-production, existing satellite imagery was reviewed to provide points of comparison to the real-time data obtained during flight. In other words, what has changed, if anything, since the last time satellite imagery was obtained? Each reach was divided into 50-meter segments. Riparian vegetation on each riverbank within a 30.4-meter, approximately 100 feet buffer was documented, along with any structures or buildings within this 30.4-meter buffer. If any structures or buildings were built within the 30.4-meter buffer within the last decade, since 2010, it was noted. A table for each reach was created, along with maps that show the approximate routes that were flown by the UAV to collect the data. Reach segments are reported from the upstream reach break to the downstream reach break, as indicated on the maps. The methodology employed to measure riparian buffer widths, assess riparian vegetative health, and examine surrounding land uses on these respective rivers was a real success. The granular level detail provided by low altitude 110 to 120 meter UAV flights would have been difficult, expensive, and dangerous to obtain through any other method. The data delivered in post-production is essentially real time. At the time of writing, November 2021, the flights were conducted approximately 5 weeks ago in October of 2021. The amount of distance that was covered in a relatively short amount of time, 1 to 2 days for each 900 to 1,000 meter reach, would make scaling a similar operation possible. It's not hard to envision scenarios where a team of UAV operators, with a few hours of hands-on training, would be able to cover entire streams, entire rivers, and entire water bodies over a series of days and weeks. The DJI Mini SE is a relatively inexpensive UAV. It retails for approximately $300. Other UAVs have more features. For example, obstacle avoidance. They allow for pre-programmed flight routing, better battery life, higher resolution cameras, greater range. And the scientific application possibilities are truly limitless. For these assessments, the reaches that were examined measured from 900 to 1,000 meters in length. As such, no broad conclusions should be made about the overall condition of riparian health on the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River. What can be concluded is that in the specific reaches that were examined for these assessments, riparian buffers were intact and in good health. There's ample vegetation consisting of trees, woody shrubs, and herbaceous plants within the 30.4 meter riparian buffer. These three reaches were examined to gauge whether low-density residential construction, fueled by rapid population growth, was directly, physically altering riparian areas on the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River. In all three instances, no visible adverse environmental impacts were occurring to the vegetative buffers in the riparian areas examined for these assessments. Urban-to-rural interfaces play an important role in cities that are undergoing rapid urbanization and geographic expansion. When woodlands and shrublands, agricultural lands, green fields, otherwise vacant lands are lost to development, species can be displaced, but others can take their place, and sometimes this happens to surprising extents. Much depends on the specific geographic context. For example, an agricultural field converted to a subdivision is going to yield a different impact than woodlands that are converted to a subdivision. What does change because of urbanization is where and how species are grouped. Specialist species, typically dependent on the original localized condition, are often replaced by generalist species that are able to adapt to the new conditions that emerge and are better equipped to survive in an evolving landscape. This process of specialists being replaced by generalists is called biotic homogenization, and overall it's damaging to biological diversity. It's important to note that the urban-to-rural interface is not a singular point on a map. It is evolving. It's changing as the metropolitan area changes. It's amorphous, where the built environment meets the natural environment. And it includes those non-industrial scale agricultural lands, like family-owned farms and ranches. The urban-to-rural interface is dependent on the ever-changing and evolving nature of development occurring in the area. Of the analyses that were completed as a part of this research, this one was the most difficult to execute, the largest in scale, and the least conclusive in terms of results due to its qualitative nature. Due to the scale involved, UAV flights near the edges of urbanized development were supplemented with windshield and walking surveys designed to gather firsthand observational data on development patterns occurring in each of these growing metropolitan areas. Prior to embarking on a windshield or walking survey in one of these respective communities, time was spent studying satellite imagery to identify land use patterns, comparing satellite imagery from years past with the most up-to-date satellite imagery available. This helped to identify patterns of development and find those pressure points where urban-to-rural interfaces exist. Mapping of the areas covered during the windshield and walking surveys was developed using Google Earth Pro and is included on the slides that follow. The routes that were taken are displayed in orange. In Bend, urban-to-rural interface points were readily visible. Identifying these transition points was relatively simple because they correspond directly to the city of Bend's urban growth boundary. Sometimes this resulted in very stark environmental contrast between the natural environment and the built environment, where low-density single-family subdivisions, complete with yards, sidewalk, roads, fences, etc., directly abutted shrublands and/or woodlands. At the time of writing, November 2021, both the Southwest Bend neighborhood and the Century West neighborhood both have single-family detached homes under construction. While suburban and exurban sprawl are not occurring in Bend per se, there are neighborhoods within Bend's urban growth boundary that are suburban in terms of form and function. An example of one such neighborhood that is suburban in form and function in Bend is on your screen now, and this is the Southwest Bend neighborhood, which again has homes that are currently under construction. It's beautifully situated right on the Deschutes River. This is a neighborhood with curvilinear streets and large lots and large houses. It's approximately 5.5 miles one way from Southwest Bend into downtown Bend, at least from where this photograph was taken. So in function, it is a suburban neighborhood. In form, it is a suburban neighborhood. In the photograph on the right, you'll see the urban growth boundary's edge and the starkness that's provided by it. You'll notice that the road, sidewalk, and public infrastructure all end at the edge of the boundary. In the middle of that photograph, it is hard to see, but there's actually a white sign, and that white sign denotes the area beyond the fence as a wildlife area. The scale and pace of development in the greater Boise metropolitan area was orders of magnitude larger than what was seen and measured in Bend and Bozeman. Urban to rural interfaces were sporadically located due to the intensive suburban and exurban development occurring. In total, there are 15 municipalities in Ada County and Canyon County. All of these municipalities have land use and zoning control, which can lead to the patchy nature development that was observed. At the time of writing, there are hundreds of single-family detached homes being constructed in the Boise metropolitan area, and suburban and exurban sprawl is occurring throughout Ada County and Canyon County. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of agricultural lands being converted to low-density residential land uses. Over the next several slides, you'll see aerial photographs from throughout the Boise metropolitan area. These photographs provide a glimpse of the types of residential developments that are occurring in these communities. They also show the contrast in land uses on the surrounding parcels. The image on your screen now is in the Boise Hills, which serve as the backdrop for the city of Boise. These homes were constructed after the year 2002. The aerial image on your screen now is looking north and shows a subdivision that is currently under construction directly abutting a cornfield. The newer homes, which are located just to the west of the road in the photograph, were built on farm fields, and those farm fields were still under cultivation through the year 2018. This aerial photograph was taken in the city of Meridian, and Meridian is the fastest growing city in the state of Idaho. The subdivision on the left of the photograph directly confronts an agricultural use across the street. It illustrates the stark contrast in land uses that can be seen as you move away from Boise's downtown core. This photograph was taken approximately 11.8 miles from downtown Boise. This aerial image is illustrative of exurban development within the Boise metropolitan area. You have a suburban inform neighborhood directly across the street from an agricultural use. This neighborhood is relatively disconnected from other suburban neighborhoods. The isolation of this land use, separated from other similar land uses, is what makes it exurban. There's a lot going on in the photographs on your screen now. You'll see the goats in front of the new construction in the top photograph to the left. On the bottom left, you see a photograph of land for sale, scrubland for sale in Caldwell, Idaho. This is located in Canyon County to the west of Boise on your way to Oregon. And then on the photograph on the right, you see a horse farm that directly abuts a residential subdivision. Urban to rural interfaces in Bozeman were easier to identify than those in Boise. Development is limited by topography to the east and is occurring directly west of the city of Bozeman in the unincorporated areas surrounding Gallatin Gateway and Four Corners, and also near the city of Belgrade. There are 3 incorporated cities in Gallatin County. 2 of these cities are within the Bozeman metropolitan area, the city of Bozeman and the city of Belgrade. Gallatin County is responsible for those unincorporated areas that do not fall under the purview of Bozeman or Belgrade. At the time of writing, there are dozens of single-family detached homes being constructed in the greater Bozeman area. Lands that were previously used for agricultural use are being converted to subdivisions. Suburban sprawl is occurring. The existing urban to rural interfaces in between the triangle that is formed by Bozeman, Belgrade, and Four Corners will continue to face development pressure for the foreseeable future. Furthermore, directly south of Four Corners, along the transportation corridor connecting Four Corners to Gallatin Gateway, residential subdivisions are being constructed in the vicinity of Gallatin Gateway. This aerial photograph is looking to the east, looking back at Bozeman, and it illustrates the close proximity of the city of Bozeman to these agricultural lands that are under intense development pressure in Gallatin County. In addition, this photograph illustrates how topography, the mountains to the east of Bozeman, limit development in that direction. This is an example of a low-density residential subdivision located in an unincorporated community within Gallatin County. As we discussed earlier, the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River are vital to the health, environment, economy, and general welfare of the people who live and visit Bend, Boise, and Bozeman. Water quality tests were conducted on each of these respective rivers to see what, if any, adverse impacts were occurring to water quality because of the growth and development occurring proximate to these waterways. The results from these respective water quality tests should not serve as the foundation for definitive conclusions to be made about the overall water quality of the Deschutes River, the Boise River, or the Gallatin River. A regular sampling schedule with dozens of tests completed over a defined period would provide the basis for more scientifically sound conclusions about the overall health of these respective waterways. Water samples were taken using an earth force, low-cost water quality monitoring kit. One sample point was selected on each of the respective rivers. The sample point was selected based on it being publicly accessible and having a safe collection point to retrieve the water. The tests were conducted immediately following retrieval. The following water quality measures were tested for: water temperature, turbidity, dissolved oxygen, percent saturation, and pH. In addition, a single coliform bacteria screen was conducted at each sample site. The coliform bacteria screens were sealed and stored in darkness for 48 hours. In all three instances, on all three rivers, the water temperature was cold, the turbidity was low, the pH was excellent, and the percent saturation was within the threshold of what was to be expected for these respective river sections. The complete results, along with mapping showing the respective sample sites on the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River, are included on the slides that follow. For this final project, a combination of qualitative and quantitative analyses were used to assess what impact the rapid population growth that is currently occurring in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman is having on the natural environment. The analyses included a focus on population growth, riparian health, urban-to-rural interfaces, and water quality. The work was done using the proverbial toolbox approach, including but not limited to the use of electronic data sets, the utilization of an uncrewed aerial vehicle, direct observation, geospatial software research, and extensive first-hand fieldwork. I am so excited to share with you some of the findings that were derived from this research. Our first research question was, is suburban and exurban sprawl occurring in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman? And we can conclusively say that in all three cities and their respective counties, population densities are on the rise. Nonetheless, suburban and exurban sprawl persist in Boise and Bozeman, and in 2016, Bend expanded its urban growth boundary to accommodate additional growth. Bend's urban growth boundary does deter suburban and exurban sprawl from occurring. And while there are certainly neighborhoods in Bend, such as the Southwest Bend neighborhood, that in form and in function operate as suburbs, there is not suburban and exurban sprawl occurring outside of the municipal limits. By contrast, Boise has suburban and exurban sprawl occurring at a rapid rate, occurring across multiple counties and involving more than a dozen municipalities. In the future, it is entirely possible that this sprawl will extend to the Oregon border. Bozeman also has suburban and exurban sprawl, but it's contained by the topography surrounding the city of Bozeman. Mountains are located to the east of Bozeman, and the Gallatin River is located to the west of Bozeman. Areas of open space, whether they be agricultural lands or vacant lands, located within the triangle formed by Four Corners, the city of Belgrade, and the city of Bozeman, are under intense development. In this part of Gallatin County, urbanization of the main east-west and north-south traffic corridors is occurring. Unincorporated areas within this portion of Gallatin County are also under intense development pressure. This aerial photograph of the Southwest Bend neighborhood is approximately 5.5 miles from downtown Bend. Prior to development, it was woodlands and shrubland. This aerial photograph is in Meridian, Idaho, approximately 11.8 miles from downtown Boise. Prior to development, this land was agricultural. This subdivision is located in an unincorporated area in Gallatin County named Four Corners. It is approximately 8.8 miles from downtown Bozeman. Prior to development, it was agricultural land. It is located within close proximity to the Gallatin River. Something that should be made very clear is just because suburban and exurban sprawl might be occurring in a given community, it does not necessarily mean adverse environmental impacts are occurring within that same community. And this brings us to our second research question. Now that we've established where exurban and suburban sprawl are occurring in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman, are there any adverse environmental impacts occurring as a result of these growth patterns? Riparian area assessments were completed for 900 to 1,000 meter reaches on the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River. All three riparian area assessments, while limited to these 900 to 1,000 meter reaches, showed intact and robust vegetative buffers in each river's respective riparian buffer, which was measured 30.4 meters on both riverbanks. Water quality is directly tied to riparian health. Water sustains life. Our collective existence depends on it. In Bend, Boise, and Bozeman, it serves as the basis for water-based economic generating recreational tourism. The water quality tests that were completed on the Deschutes River, the Boise River, and the Gallatin River showed that all three rivers had cold water, low turbidity, excellent pH, and percent saturation levels consistent with the environmental conditions at the respective sampling sites. All three of the cities that were examined for this research and their surrounding metropolitan areas are growing in population. As the populations grow in these areas, so does the infrastructure required to sustain those populations. Eventually, infrastructure needs repair. And if it's not repaired, it can lead to failure. And when failure occurs, there can be adverse environmental impacts. Infrastructure is not inexpensive to maintain, and typically the responsibility for this maintenance falls on the municipality. If fiscal finances suffer for any reason, deferred maintenance can occur. And again, once this infrastructure fails, it can lead to adverse impacts to the natural environment. This is not something that was visibly seen during the work completed for this project. What was seen was a lot of new infrastructure that has been recently installed as the population of these communities has grown. It's something that each of these municipalities and the metropolitan areas surrounding the municipalities need to keep in mind as they move forward in the future. Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are all located in regions that can suffer droughts. In Bozeman, the local government is cognizant that the region's water supply may not be enough to sustain its current growth rate. The City of Bozeman Water Conservation Division notes that absent conservation measures, Bozeman's water supply, which is currently dependent on yearly snowpack, could be in jeopardy within 15 years. As such, water conservation has been identified as the, quote, single largest source of water for our future, end quote. Many of you are probably familiar with the booklets that you'll find at the entrance to restaurants when you go to visit a community like Bozeman. And these booklets have advertisements for local restaurants and shops and maybe have tips and tricks about trails and things to check out in the community. Well, on one of the very first pages of one of these booklets is an advertisement from the City of Bozeman Water Conservation Division discussing water supply. Bozeman is way out ahead of this issue as they recognize that 15 years is a relatively short amount of time, and they're trying to make it tangible and easy to understand for residents and visitors to take collective action to ensure that they have a water supply that is sufficient for their future. The urban to rural interface analyses that were conducted showed an ever-changing boundary between what constituted urbanized and what constituted rural in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman. Bend's urban growth boundary does show a clear line of demarcation in the city of Bend. Although developable lands within that urban growth boundary, typically infill lots or acreage consisting of shrublands, are being built out or are being advertised for build-out. This begs the question of what is the environmental value of such pieces of property? In urban planning and in practice, infill development, additional density, is regarded as being a mitigation technique for preventing adverse environmental effects, and for achieving greater sustainability. But if this additional density within the urban core eliminates an important habitat or causes habitat fragmentation or disrupts a wildlife corridor, are there other adverse impacts to biological communities that might occur? This report did briefly touch on how urbanization leads to biotic homogenization and is overall damaging to biological diversity. But if the alternative was to develop similar lands on the outer fringes of Bend, in other words, sprawl, the environmental outcome and any adverse impact to biological diversity might not be any different. And this does create a paradox, especially in Bend, where an urban growth boundary prevents development alternatives outside of municipal limits. But it also highlights the opportunity for open spaces with native species being planted to be integrated into infill design schemes. The amount of suburban and exurban sprawl occurring throughout the Treasure Valley is significant. Infill lands are being developed rapidly. This is occurring across 12 municipal jurisdictions, and lands on the outer fringes of the metropolitan area that were once open, undeveloped, or in a natural state are being converted to low-density residential uses. Due to the topography of the area and the waterways in the region, development is generally spreading westward. The urban-to-rural interface is changing as this development continues to evolve. It's not hard to envision a scenario where Jim County and Payette County could both see increased suburban and exurban growth. The Snake River divides the state of Idaho from the state of Oregon, but it's not hard to imagine a situation where cross-jurisdictional development starts occurring in Oregon's easternmost counties, specifically in the area surrounding the city of Ontario. The same potential impacts to biodiversity described for the city of Bend apply to the city of Boise as well, and the area surrounding Boise. In Boise, it's unclear where urbanized development ends and rural or natural areas begin. Again, questions abound about whether new developments are integrating designated spaces with native plantings and vegetation to provide refuge for native species that might have had their habitats destroyed or disconnected by development. Like Boise, much of the land development that is occurring in Bozeman and in Gallatin County is occurring on lands that were previously used for agricultural purposes. Anecdotally, in October 2021, a lifelong Bozeman resident shared that many of their friends had grown up on local family farms, but when given the choice between selling the family farm and acquiring life-changing money, they chose to sell. And it wasn't because they wanted residential development necessarily, but because farming and ranching, while incredibly rewarding and emotionally fulfilling, was uncompromisingly hard work, and it was work fraught with financial risk and uncertainties. What effect the loss of agricultural lands has on the natural environment is context-driven. It's very complicated. In general, and in an ideal world, communities would be served by locally owned farms and ranches that are within the greater metropolitan area, and these locally owned farms and ranches would be using good practices. They wouldn't be using pesticides or fertilizers or genetically modified crops. They wouldn't be putting antibiotics into their livestock, nor would they be overusing water. All of these things can have adverse impacts on the natural environment. And when farmland is lost, when farming and ranching become more disconnected from the populations they serve, this can result in a situation where food miles traveled increases, which of course can lead to more carbon emissions. But again, this is just one factor that should be considered when looking at what impact the loss of agricultural lands has on the natural environment. Wildfires play an important, even vital role in ecology for certain species of plants and animals, but they also result in the loss of habitat for other species. They reduce air quality. They release CO2 into the atmosphere. They destroy structures, buildings, and infrastructure. And they can hurt the local economy by damaging tourism. Moreover, the structures, buildings, and infrastructure that are rebuilt in the wake of a wildfire consume more raw materials. The cycle of fire, rebuild, and repeat is not conducive to a healthy ecosystem or economy. It's also not sustainable. Unfortunately, as anthropogenic activity increases in an area, so does the risk of catastrophic wildfire. A 2018 article published by the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences discusses wildfire risk in the West, noting that future climate projections show a decrease in summer precipitation, which is one factor that increases the risk of wildfire activity. Bend is proximate to fire-prone lands. As anthropogenic activity, for example, the construction of houses, gets pushed closer and closer to these areas, the risk for a potentially dangerous situation increases. And to be clear, it's not the construction process that will necessarily lead to wildfire, although it can lead to a wildfire. It's the anthropogenic activity associated with people living in those houses, with people being within the wildfire interface, that leads to a higher risk for wildfires occurring. Nationally, approximately 88% of wildfires are the result of direct anthropogenic activities. The image on your screen is of houses being constructed within 1 mile or 1.6 kilometers of Deschutes National Forest within the city of Bend. There are a number of cross-jurisdictional lessons that were learned during the course of this research. There are design features and policy measures in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman that could help other communities grow smartly, help other communities achieve greater sustainability, and help other communities address the challenges associated with the era of climate change to the maximum extent practicable. It should be noted that these cross-jurisdictional lessons are not limited to just those municipalities and those places in the United States that are growing. These lessons could be applied to cities that are leveling in population or cities that are even declining in population. Bend's urban growth boundary stands out as a successful model for growing residents and businesses while also mitigating impacts to the natural environment. It's not perfect, and it sometimes is controversial, but it's a tool that could be looked to be implemented in other communities. In Oregon, an urban growth boundary may be expanded to accommodate growth, but the expansion must be agreed upon by the city, in this instance Bend, and the county, in this instance Deschutes County. Such an agreement for expansion would need to be addressed through the City of Bend's comprehensive plan, and Bend's comprehensive plan is required to be consistent with the state of Oregon's statewide land use planning goals. One part of Bend's comprehensive plan that is required is a plan to accommodate additional growth, and this includes a 20-year supply of land for housing. In 2016, Bend expanded its urban growth boundary to accommodate additional growth, which begs the question, why have an urban growth boundary if it is only going to be expanded continuously to accommodate population growth? Would it be better, from an environmental impact mitigation perspective, to denote the urban growth boundary on a map and then adjust the subject community's zoning regulations to accommodate greater density and alternative building forms as opposed to low-density residential? Such a concept is challenging because, as we discussed earlier, the vast majority of Americans desire to live in a single-family detached home, and a 2019 estimate from the American Community Survey projects about 62.4% of Americans already do live in single-family detached homes. So it's a building form that is incredibly popular, and it's a building form that is incredibly wanted by most Americans. Implementing an urban growth boundary for a city or a county in Idaho or Montana or another state would potentially require amendments to state enabling legislation. It could be incredibly unpopular from a political point of view, and it would likely result in legal challenges. But again, from an environmental impact mitigation perspective, urban growth boundaries can go a long way in addressing how populations grow and how geographic footprints affect the natural environment. While obtaining the aerial photography and the aerial video, it was noticed that in a number of these communities, in a number of these neighborhoods, some of the houses are built really, really close together. There's a significant amount of density being achieved even though the dominant building form is a single-family detached home. Just a few feet separate the walls in these houses from their neighboring house. And so they're not sharing a wall like a multifamily building may or a townhouse may, but they are in effect are squeezing more houses onto tighter spaces in these communities. And that's something that could be looked at across jurisdictions, that baseline density requirements should consider spatial scale and building dimensionality, unit counts and lot measurements. They could look to have more infill development, and particularly residential, which could be allowed and perhaps encouraged in all zoning districts. Accessory dwelling units, ADUs, could be allowed in residential districts. These are some of the ways that you could get more density while also balancing the desire for people to live in their own single-family building. From a biological diversity perspective, a very easy to implement solution that could be done at a municipal level would be a program to help homeowners adapt their yards and gardens to include native vegetation and native plantings. Such a program could help prevent habitat destruction or habitat fragmentation, which in turn would ensure the survival of native species. Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are all home to some incredible parks. One park that stood out to me was the Boise River Greenbelt, which has shielded the Boise River from development impacts for over 50 years through vigorous vegetative buffers along much of its length. It is a linear park that extends from the densest portion of the metropolitan area, downtown Boise, and extends into the city of Star, a suburb to the west of Boise. The stretches of the Boise River beyond Star, especially near the growing city of Caldwell in Canyon County, do not have a designated greenbelt in place. That's unfortunate because the greenbelt provides tangible environmental benefits to water quality and species abundance and richness, while also providing a direct recreational connection for residents and visitors to connect to nature, and functionally it provides another transportation corridor for biking, walking, and running. The Boise River Greenbelt is a remarkable success story. There are people that are trout fishing in the middle of the river as you walk down the path beside it. It is truly remarkable to see this in a downtown core, a heavily urbanized area, but it's happening. And the Boise River Greenbelt is a concept, a linear park concept that could be implemented not only in Bend or other parts of Boise or Bozeman, but it could be implemented in cities and metropolitan areas across the United States. It's really a remarkable success story. Neighborhood pocket parks are nothing new, but this particular neighborhood pocket park near the Southwest Bend neighborhood stood out to me. This one has native vegetation and plantings spread throughout it, and it's largely an unprogrammed space. There is a walking path that takes you through this little park, and there are some benches and tables, but it's a great example of how a small park can provide a critical connection point on a habitat corridor to a native species. This is right above the Deschutes River. So a park like this can provide critical habitat to native species that might have otherwise been displaced. And again, it provides a great opportunity for residents and visitors to connect to nature directly. Open space protection is becoming a talking point in each of these communities. In Bozeman, the Gallatin Valley Land Trust is working with property owners to establish conservation easements on their respective properties. And depending on how they are written, these easements can be designed to protect specific wildlife habitats, wildlife corridors, public access points, stream segments, and of course working farms and working ranches. In exchange for the conservation easement, the landowner can receive local tax benefits, federal tax benefits, and cash compensation. The Gallatin Valley Land Trust is a not-for-profit organization, and organizations like this could be established virtually anywhere. And these organizations can play an instrumental role in protecting community character while also mitigating adverse impacts to the natural environment. Throughout the Bozeman metropolitan area, agricultural lands are being converted to low-density residential uses. What stood out are the agricultural lands that remain, and the irrigation canals and ditches that serve these agricultural lands. Along these irrigation canals and ditches are intact riparian buffers. And if these irrigation canals and ditches happen to go through a recently constructed subdivision, the riparian buffers, even in that subdivision, were intact. And as we discussed earlier, riparian buffers absorb excess nutrients, they prevent sedimentation, and they also act as critical habitat for a range of species. In the photograph on the right, you'll see a small white sign, and this white sign is asking visitors to please respect this sensitive area. This type of public awareness, very deliberately made by the local municipality, was something that was seen throughout the Bozeman metropolitan area. It was a reverence for water quality and a realization that the economic well-being of the community is directly tied to that water quality. These types of riparian buffers could be implemented in any municipality to ensure water quality. So what does this all mean? Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are three cities that are growing at an exponential rate. They're growing at a rate that far outpaces the national average. They are all set in spectacular natural settings. This final project set out to answer some fundamental questions about the nature of the demographic and geographic growth occurring in these communities. For the most part, this final project was successful in that endeavor. People are choosing to migrate to Bend, Boise, and Bozeman due to their respective locations. They are set in beautiful areas and they have access to outdoor recreational opportunities. There's housing that is available to these new residents for purchase or rent. And there are job opportunities once they get there, and/or they have the ability to work remotely. Whether or not these communities can continue to grow at the rates they are growing, while being resilient and sustainable in the era of climate change, remains unknown, and it's an elusive question. A balance must be struck between what is attracting people to these communities and the risk that the rapid change that is occurring will at worst incur dire environmental consequences, or at a minimum damage those characteristics that attracted people to move to these places in the first place. Perhaps the biggest lesson to emerge from the research conducted for this report is that siloed, specialist-based land management mechanisms will not adequately address the issues confronting these communities. The challenges are too interrelated, and they all have nexuses to a range of environmental and socioeconomic issues that stretch across disciplines and across fields of study. The issues associated with rapid population growth, migratory patterns, and the development that is occurring in Bend, Boise, and Bozeman are regional in scale, and they're increasingly cross-state issues. And this presents a significant challenge in and of itself because of the fiscalization of land use. In other words, municipal dependence on the tax revenue generated by development and the local economy's dependence on the expectation that construction will not stop. It has created a competitive environment where cities, regions, and states are competing for residents. And as the country overall continues to level in population in the 21st century, the competition for a shrinking pool of potential residents will become fierce. And this could lead to a situation where regional and cross-state cooperation is unlikely to occur. The hope for a better environmental outcome lies in the fact that Bend, Boise, and Bozeman, and others have no choice but to cooperate. The challenges presented by the era of climate change are too great for municipal government to overcome alone. Absent regional and cross-state mutual trust and cooperation, these issues will not be adequately addressed. To achieve the goals of sustainability, resiliency, equity, and environmental protection needed by Bend, Boise, and Bozeman to ensure continued vitality and growth, fully integrated environmental impact assessment mechanisms employed at a regional scale are required to sufficiently handle these complex, interrelated issues. The work that was completed for this project is built on a foundation set by many, many others that came before me. There are over 60 references included on the slides that follow. The photographs used in this presentation and in the written report, unless otherwise noted, are my own. It takes a team, and I would like to take a moment to acknowledge all the people that helped me while I conducted the research for this report. First off, thank you to the people of the greater Bend, Boise, and Bozeman metropolitan areas. You live and work and play in places of rich history and spectacular natural beauty. I cannot wait to return to your communities. Thank you to Gordon Howard at the Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development for taking the time to speak to me. Thank you to Carrie and Doug for their generous hospitality while I was in Montana. Thank you to my committee, Holly Campbell, Diana Fisher, Douglas Reese, and Brent Steele. Thank you to my unit chair, Carolyn Fonio. This team of experts provided guidance through thoughtful feedback and by pointing me in the direction of additional resources. The previous courses that I took with these professors, and all my professors at Oregon State University, informed this project tremendously. I know you are all incredibly busy. Thank you so much for your time on my behalf. Thank you to Oregon State University, and specifically the Environmental Sciences Graduate Program and the Program in Water Conflict Management and Transformation. This would not have been possible absent your strong commitment to a robust virtual campus for students studying from afar. Thank you for providing me the opportunity to grow intellectually and to pursue my professional goals. Thank you to my family, Anne, Thomas, and Eleanor, for supporting me in this pursuit. Be strong, have courage, and never stop endeavoring to learn more and to gain a better understanding of those things that capture your interest. I hope that I have not forgotten anyone, but please know that I recognize that there were many people that helped me on this journey, and I thank them too. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this presentation today. I would welcome any feedback that you have on how I can improve this research, or any questions or comments you might have on what you heard today. Thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to hear about things that I'm passionate about, which were presented here in this presentation. I hope you have a great day, and I look forward to hearing from you.